Hello, my name is Freddy Salmon Mwijage from Edukea Tanzania. Welcome in this session to proceed with our topic, which is the first topic in Form 5, known as the pre-colonial African societies. So on the last session, we ended on the characteristics of slavery or slave mode of production. So now let us go to see the reasons that made Africa or African societies the reasons that made African societies to escape in developing slave mode of production, or why pre-colonial African societies did not develop or advance slave mode of production. The following are the reasons showing clearly that pre-colonial Africa did not develop slave as mode of production. The first reasons mean that slavery existed in a few parts of Africa as an institution and not as the mode of production this area were. It means that the reason number one that made slavery to be not developed in Africa was slavery existed in a few parts of Africa as an institution and not as mode of production. The first area where slavery existed in Africa as a few parts, as the first reasons states, it was in Zanzibar, whereby slavery existed after Sultan Said shifted his capital from Muscat, Omani to Zanzibar in 1840. So slaves were taken from Central and East Africa to perform various activities or tasks in Zanzibar Islands, like domestic activities such as cooking, mopping, fetching water, keeping gates or watch, taking care of elders and the children, and others offered labor in the cloves plantation and the coconut plantations. It means that the slavery mode of slave mode of production was taken or was developed in Africa as the institution and not mode of production. For example, in Zanzibar, the slaves were taken by after Sultan Said shifted from Oman with his capital and to settle in Zanzibar in 1840, and that made slaves to become the servants or workers workers of Sultan in Zanzibar, and performed the various activities such as cooking, mopping, fetching water, taking care for elders, keeping gates or watchmen, and taking care of children, as well as to participate in activities in clove plantations as well as coconut plantations. So the slaves were used by the Sultan in Zanzibar to perform different activities like offering labor in the cloves and the coconut plantations and taking care on the domestic activities as well as the relatives at home. Another area where slavery take place was in Egypt, whereby slaves were taken from West Sudan and the forest states or area to perform various activities during Pharaoh regime or period or rule. These activities were such as constructing canals, making calendar, building tombs, performing various domestic activities, and others. It means that the slaves were taken from Western Sudan and the other forest areas to Egypt so as to perform various activities during the Pharaoh regime or Pharaoh rule. And they performed different activities like constructing canals for transportation in water bodies, making calendar, building tombs for the people who have died, performing various domestic activities like cooking, washing clothes, and taking care of people in the pharaoh's families. Another, it was Maghreb societies. It means Maghreb societies including Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. These were Arabic African nations or Afro-Arab nations. Slaves were taken from various parts of West Africa and Northern East Africa to perform various activities in Maghreb society. For example, they were taken to offer their labor in agriculture, like palm, dates, and the domestic activities. It means that the slaves were taken from Western Africa and Northeast Africa to perform various works in the Maghreb society, including Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. And that's why the slavery was taken or considered as the institution in Africa and not as the mode of production. But the second reason that made Africa to be that made Africa wide not develop slave as mode of production and that made Africa to ignore or to deny the development of slavery mode of production in Africa. Another was slavery coexisted together with feudalism in many parts of Africa. It means that slavery and the feudalism was existed at the same time. So slavery was not considered as the mode of production which was taken so long time. So that's why the historians concluded that slavery was not taken as the mode of production in Africa. In Africa, slave mode of production was not noted as the mode of production, simply because the only mode of production in those areas was feudalism. For example, in Zanzibar, the mode of production was feudalism, however slavery also existed there. It means that, for example, in Zanzibar, the mode of production or slavery was not taken as the mode of production, and it was taken as the institution. And the mode of production that existed in Zanzibar was feudalism. So it was difficult to conclude that slavery was the mode of production in Zanzibar while there was another feudal mode of production. And the third reason was in pre-colonial African societies there was no slave masters or class of slave masters, which showed clearly that the mode of production existed in pre-colonial African society was not slavery and rather it was feudalism. It means that in pre-colonial African societies there were no slave masters or there were no class of slave masters who could be able to master or to own the slaves and use those slaves in performing different activities for slave masters. And that's why they considered slavery as the institution and not the mode of production, while the feudalism was taken as the mode of production after communalism or communal mode of production. The fourth reason was the level of development of productive forces used during the transition from primitive to feudalism showed that the slavery or slave mode of production did not exist in Africa. For example, some societies which were in transition to feudalism decided to use or to cultivate. Another reason was the level of development of productive forces used during the transition from primitive to feudalism showed that the slavery or slave mode of production did not exist in Africa. For example, some societies which were in transition to feudalism decided to use or to cultivate on the land, which showed that mode of production existed was feudalism based on land ownership. So it means that the level of development of productive forces that were used in Africa during the transition from communalism or primitive communalism to feudalism was showed that the Africans was usually the NO, that the tools which were used was used to cultivate on the land, and that land was the major means of production, which was termed as the common factor in the production during the feudalism or feudal mode of production. That's why the historians concluded that the African societies transformed from communalism to feudalism, and slavery was not considered as the mode of production. So after looking the reason that made why African did not develop the slave mode of production, we have finished. So let us see how slavery was transitioned, or it means transition from feudalism, from slavery to feudal mode of production. What were the factors that made transition from slavery to feudal mode of production? The major factor for the decline of slavery and the emergence of feudal mode of production were as follows. The first one was improvement of productive forces during slavery, changed the social and the technical relation of production, and geared to the decline of slave mode of production and the rise of feudalism. It means that the improvement of productive forces during the slavery, it means changed the social and the technical relation of production that geared the decline of slavery and gave the chance for the rise of a feudal mode of production. Another was existence of class struggle in slavery. It means that there was the series of frequent conflicts between slave masters and the slaves. So the series of slaves uprising against the masters at the end of the day led to the collapse of slave mode of production and hence emergence of feudalism. It means that the emergence or the existence of class struggle was led to the decline of slavery, whereby the slaves were against their masters, known as slave masters, and that made or marked the end of the slave model production and the emergence of feudalism. Another factor was the failure of the productive forces to correspond with social and technical relation production or relation of production. According to Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883 pointed out that if productive forces and the social and technical relation of production in a certain mode of production are not going hand in hand with the existing mode of production, then such mode of production will collapse and pave a way to another mode of production. It means that the productive forces failed to correspond with the social and technical relation of production that was existed. So that paved the way for the rise of feudalism and paved the way for the rise of feudal mode of production, and the slavery was collapsing because the social and technical relation of production was not correspondent to the productive forces during the slavery. So probably the slavery could be collapsed or decline, and that's why the feudal mode of production was come into being. For example, according to Karl Marx, who lived between in 1818 to 1883, pointed out that the productive forces, if does not correspond with social and technical relation of production, as soon as that mode of production will possibly collapse because of the absence of relationship between productive forces and the social and technical relation of production. Another or the fourth factor for the transition from slavery to feudalism was slaves lacked the interest in labor. It means that slaves lacked the interest in labor. It means that slaves were not preferred to be used in production. They frequently destroyed the equipment of production owned by slave masters, hence slavery collapsed. It means the slaves who were used by the slave owners or slave masters. The slaves frequently destroyed the equipments which were used in production, and that led to the collapse of slavery, because the owners of slaves got the negative effects of the slaves, because they were distracting the equipments of production that were owned by their masters, and that made the slavery mode of production or slavery to collapse and give the way for the rise of feudalism or feudal mode of production. The fifth one, the cruel exploitation of slaves and the ruthlessness and the oppression done by the slave master to slaves led the slaves to revolt against the slave masters, and slaves become free from being controlled by the slave masters. This led to the collapse of slavery or slave mode of production. It means that there was the cruel exploitation and oppression done by the slave master towards the slaves, and thus made the slaves to be free, or they employed the revolts which made the slave masters to give the freedom for the slaves, and led to the collapse of slavery, because slavery had no room to proceed prevailing in the area, and that gave the way for feudalism or feudal mode of production to take the chance. Another factor for the transition from slavery to feudal mode of production was the slave owners or slave master with a vast number of slaves were not interested in including the tools of production. They continued to use the only productive forces, which automatically led to the collapse of slave mode of production. It means that the slave masters or slave owners they did not want to change the tools of production which were used during slavery, and that's why they continued with the use of all the tools or productive forces, which automatically could lead to the collapse of slavery and gave the chance for the rise of feudal mode of production. And the last factor for the transition of slavery to feudal mode of production was the constant military campaigns led to the number of slaves to drop down, and the price to get slaves increased. This led slave masters to fail to continue with this mode of production. It means that there was constant military campaign led to the number of slaves to drop down, and the price was get higher. It means the price of getting the slaves were becoming higher or was increasing, and that was made the difficulties in attaining the slaves by the slave masters, and the using of slaves were no longer in the need, and that marked the collapse of the slavery or slave mode of production and gave the rise of feudal mode of production in the area. So let us see another or the last exploitative mode of production, the last pre-colonial African mode of production. This is feudal mode of production. It means this is the third mode of production in human history. This was the second exploitative mode of production based on private ownership of land. It was common in Africa since 14th to 19th century. It means that this was the second exploitative mode of production which was existed in Africa, and it's based on the private ownership of land. It means that the landlords were owning the lands, and the workers or serfs or tenants were working on the strips of the land on behalf of the landlords or landowners. And it was common in Africa since 14th century to 19th century. So you can see it lasted almost 5 centuries in Africa. Examples of societies practiced feudalism. The first society was higher in Tanganyika, or by now it is Tanzania. So higher society in northern part of Tanzania practiced feudalism, specifically in Nicaragua, whereby there was the mode of production, the feudal system known as Nyarubanja. So this was the feudal system that was practiced in Aya tribe or Aya society in the northern Tanzania or northern part of Tanzania. But there is Zulu in South Africa. This was another society present in South Africa where feudal mode of production was practiced. But there are some other examples which have not been mentioned here. There is Umwini feudal system that took place around the coastal areas. For example, in Zanzibar, there was Umwini that was the feudal system that was used by the Umwini, by the people of around the coast of Indian Ocean. But there is another example which took place in Hutu and Tutsi. There was the Ubugabile, whereby the Hutu and Tutsi were practicing the feudal mode of production under the system of Ubugabile, whereby there was the two classes. The Hutus were the slaves or workers of the Tutsi. So these were examples of societies practicing feudalism. Let us see the features of feudal mode of production. What were the features or characteristics of feudal mode of production? The first one was existence of two dominant classes. It means that feudal mode of production are the two dominant classes. Feudalism involved two classes, which was feudalords and the workers or tenants, or in another name we can call serfs. It means that there were dominant classes, that is the feudalords and peasants. The feudalords or landlords controlled or owned the land, and the peasants were employed by the landowners or feudalords. It means that there were two classes whereby the feudalords or landlords were employing the peasants to work on their lands, and those tenants or peasants were paying the rent to the landlords in form of three kinds, in form of three rents, whereby there were rent in kind, rent in labor, and the rent in money. So these were three types of rent that were paid by the peasant to their landlords. Another characteristic was private ownership. It means that feudalism was characterized by private ownership of major means of production. It was characterized by private ownership, as in the major means of production were controlled by the feudalords. It means that the major means of production as was considered as land, so the land was controlled by the few people who were known as feudalords or landlords. For example, land and cattle were property of the feudalords. It means that the major means of production that included the land and the cattle were property of the feudal lords. If peasants wanted to use the land, they had to pay the rent that was paid into three types: in rent in kind, rent in money, and rent in labor. Another characteristic was exploitation. It means that there was exploitation between man by man during the feudal mode of production, which was characterized by exploitation of money by man, because major means of production were controlled by few people who are the feudalords or landlords. So peasants were exploited through payments of rent. It means that the feudalords were owning the land, and that land were worked by the peasants, and the peasants were supposed to pay the rent to their landlords or feudalords in 3 types of rent, whereby they paid rent in money, rent in kind, and the rent in labor. So there was the exploitation of peasants by paying to their feudalords or landlords. Another was advanced tools of production. It means that there was advanced tools of production. The tools which were used in production during the feudal mode of production was advanced compared to the previous modes of production during communal mode of production and the slave mode of production. The level of productive forces was advanced, which led to high level of production. This led to availability of surplus. It means that during the feudal mode of production, there was advancement of productive forces which was used in production. So that led to the increased level of production, and the surplus was available because there was the increase of production of products. So the surplus was created. So these were the pre-colonial African societies which was existed before the coming of colonialists. Pre-colonial African societies, at the time of colonization, most of pre-colonial African society production. It means that when colonization was introduced in Africa, some of the societies were under the communal mode of production, but during the transition there are some societies which were under the feudal mode of production. The slave mode of production was not well developed because most of the African society transformed from the communal mode directly to the feudal mode of production. It means that the slave mode of production was not well developed in Africa because most of the African societies transformed directly from communal mode of production to feudal mode of production. There were various characteristics of pre-colonial African societies. Let us see the features or characteristics of pre-colonial African societies. The first one, the family was the basic unit of production. It means that during the pre-colonial African societies, the basic unit of production was the family. It means that the family was used in production, or the family member was used in production as the labor. This limited the division of labor, and it was hindrance to the development of science and technology. Consequently, agricultural production was always low in pre-colonial Africa. It means that the family has used the labor in production. This limited the division of labor and marked the hindrance or led to the hindrance to the development of science and technology in pre-colonial African society. Hence, led to the agricultural production become less developed or become low in production. The second characteristic of pre-colonial African societies was the level of productive forces was very low because the tools used were made of stones. It means that the level of productive forces which were used during the pre-colonial African societies was very low because the tools which were used in production was made up of stones. The use of primitive tools led to the low level of production, which in turn contributed to the absence of surplus that could be used for the future use. It means that the use of primitive tools or local tools in production led to the low level of production, and there was no production of surplus that could be used in future consumption or future uses. Another or the third feature or characteristic of feudal model of pre-colonial African society was land was the commonest object of labor. It means that the land was the common or commonest object of labor. Its distribution was on cultural values and the traditions. In the clan organization, land was distributed by the clan head on customary laws. It means that the land was the common object of labor, whereby its distribution was based on the cultural values and the traditions. For example, in the clan organizations, land was distributed by the head of the clan, or clan head, or based on the custom laws. These were laws which were guiding in the distribution of the land on the clan organizations, like in Maasai. So let us see another characteristics, which is there were some class society in pre-colonial Africa. It means that there were some classes, or there were some class society in pre-colonial Africa. For example, under the slave model of production, there was a class of slave master and the slaves, and in the feudal model of production was characterized by a class of landlords and the feudal lords and the peasants. It means that in pre-colonial African societies there were some classes in societies that were present during the modes of production. Like during the feudal mode of production, there were two classes known as slave masters and slaves, while in the feudal mode of production there were landlords or feudal lords and the peasants. So these were classes which were present in the societies. Another feature of pre-colonial African societies was the major economic activities were agriculture and the pastoralism. It means that the African societies before the coming of colonialism, their major economic activities was agriculture and the pastoralism. Agriculture was mainly carried out by feudal societies, and it was common in the intercrystalline regions. I mean the area which were around the water bodies. Pastoralism was mainly practiced by societies that the level in the Rift Valley region, for example the Maasai of East Africa. It means that agriculture was mainly carried out at the areas which were along the intercrystalline regions or water bodies. And the pastoralism was mainly practiced in the society that was in the Rift Valleys. For example, Maasai in East Africa are the best example of pastoralist society. Another feature was the pre-colonial African society were pre-capitalist, because there are three modes of production. The pre-colonial African societies were pre-capitalist because there are three modes of production, that is communal, slavery, and the feudal mode of production. The capitalist mode of production was introduced during colonialism. It means that the pre-colonial African societies are the three modes of production which preceded the capitalist mode of capitalism or capitalist mode of production. And the last one was production in pre-colonial Africa was mainly for consumption and not for the market. It means that the production which produced in pre-colonial African societies was meant for the consumption and not for the surplus in bathing for market or trading activities. Production for the market was introduced during colonialism, whereby Africans were producing raw materials for the export markets. It means that during the colonialism, it is when the production for the market or for the surplus use in trading activities was introduced, when the Africans were producing the raw materials for the export of that goods or raw materials in metro or in European countries. Something to note: it should be noted that the pre-colonial African societies were not at the same level of development. So this is the terms and points which you have to take into the consideration, that the pre-colonial African societies were not at the same level of development. So they were different, or they were in different levels of development.
Purchase your tracks today.